So let's dig deep into this important gateway concept of relevance. Relevance is really sort of the major hurdle that you have to jump over in order to convince a judge that the evidence you want to bring in is allowed to be in the courtroom. And that might sound strange. You might say, well, why would the judge care whether or not the judge is allowed to look at the evidence? Doesn't the judge have to look at the evidence in order to decide whether the judge is allowed to look at the evidence? It becomes much more significant in cases involving juries because the judge decides what the jury gets to look at. But in practice, when the judge is deciding that something is irrelevant, really they're deciding that, look, I've already seen it, I don't care what it says anyway, so the decision doesn't end up being as important. But in the case where, let's say you're suing a club on Crescent Street because you've got broken eardrums over the weekend, you want to establish that they should be paying reparations for your broken eardrums, right? Let's say the piece of evidence that we're looking at and whether we're deciding whether it should be allowed in the courtroom is a doctor's report from Sunday morning saying at the emergency room showing a recently perforated eardrum, nominally from the night before. So this report is directly showing that your eardrums were indeed broken. That's what you're alleging. That's what you're suing them for. So it qualifies as evidence, right? It passes the test. It directly proves a fact that's central to the case. Let's look at a case like this. You're suing somebody for breach of contract because you paid him $50 for an iPhone on eBay that he would send you by mail. And the one he sends to you has no screen left. And so you're saying, well, this is ridiculous. When I paid $50, I should expect to get the actual phone. Maybe, if you're expecting to pay $50 for an iPhone, maybe that's your own fault, but whatever. So you want to show proof of your PayPal transaction to show that you actually did pay $50. Since this is the damages that you're looking for in the case, this is directly relevant to the case, then once again, it proves something that's central to the case. That's going to be evidence. Let's look at this example, though. Let's say you're suing a restaurant for food poisoning, right? And as part of your case, you want to bring in newspaper surveys that show that more consumers prefer another restaurant. And you might say, well, probably people prefer the other restaurant because they don't like this one because maybe they had food poisoning experiences there, right? It's possible that there could be some vague connection between what your fact is saying and the point you're trying to prove. But if it's not direct enough, if it's not directly proving this fact that's central to the case, then it's not going to qualify as relevant. It's not going to qualify as evidence. It doesn't make it over the hurdle. It isn't allowed into the courtroom. The judge will throw it out. Let's say you want to sue a phone company for false advertising because they advertised what looked like a deal and you went in for the deal and then they went back on you and you feel like, these guys are real jerks. I want the judge to understand these people are real jerks. And I happen to have photos of an employee of this phone company vandalizing a rival cell phone store. This is just the kind of people they are to screw people over like this. They'd even trash another store. Now, you can see why you think this makes sense, and the judge should hear about this to know what kind of people these are. But these photos don't prove your point. So even though they make the other side look bad, that's not enough. It has to prove something that's central to the case, or else it doesn't qualify as relevant. In this case, these are not evidence. They don't meet the standard of being relevant. They'd have to be thrown out. Let's look at another example. Let's say you're suing someone for selling you a car. And you realize after you buy the car that it has no engine in it. Now you have the transcript of a previous court case where this same guy was successfully sued for selling a plane with no wings to somebody else who was almost as gullible as you. Would this be relevant? Well, this is actually kind of a tricky one. There's a whole concept of what we would call similar fact evidence to go into here. In this case, it likely wouldn't be relevant enough, but it is more complicated than the other ones we've looked at. Now, where it gets complicated is these situations where we have to balance probative value versus prejudicial effect. And this is like the borderline cases for relevance often involve this balancing act. Probative value on the one side, which proves something, that's just a fancy way of saying prove something, probative value, And prejudicial effect is just a fancy way of saying it throws dirt. It makes somebody look bad. Prejudiced, like it's prejudicing the court against this person. It's prejudging. It's making this person look bad before they can actually judge whether the facts that are central to the case are true or not. So this is always the balancing exercise. How much does the evidence actually prove? Versus how much does it really just make the side look bad? And it is a balancing exercise, because if something makes you look pretty bad, but it also is pretty good at proving something, then it'll probably get in. If it barely proves anything, then even if it doesn't really make anybody look bad, it's not going to get in. Where this most often comes into play is where something kind of proves something, but it does a lot more of portraying the other side as looking like a bad person that it'll get thrown out even if it actually does prove something. Something can always be argued to be at least a little relevant, but in order to be considered relevant in the legal sense, what matters is that it has to be more probative than it is prejudicial. It actually has to prove something more than it just makes that other side look bad.